Good morning. John Newton continues his letter on the proper right use of the law, and he comes to his last point and he says, lastly, we use the law lawfully when we improve it as a test whereby to judge of the exercise of grace. In other words, Newton says we use the law lawfully, correctly, rightly, when we use it to test the progress of our growth in grace, our following of Jesus. He goes on to say, believers differ so much from what they once were and from what many still are, that without this right use of the law, comparing themselves with their former selves or with others, they would be prone to think more highly of their attainments than they ought. In other words, when we become a Christian, when we become a believer, we change. And that change can be so radically different from what we once were or compared to other people in the way that we exercise grace, the way that we live our lives, the way that we even follow the law. But if we're just comparing ourselves to what we once were, and we're just comparing ourselves to other people, then we fail to adequately understand the depth of our continued sin and the depth of our need for continued grace. He goes on to say, but when they recur to this standard, that is the standard of the law, when we go back to the standard of the law, instead of comparing ourselves to what we once were or compared to what other people are, when we recur to the standard of the law, he said, we sink into the dust, and we adopt the language of Job, behold, I am vile, I cannot answer thee, one of 1,000. Now, Newton, I don't think, is trying to be discouraging here at all. He's simply saying that we need to remember our continued absolute need of grace. The quote that I used as the meditative thought for last Sunday was from John Newton. Now, not from this letter, but it goes like this, and variations of it have become relatively famous, and you might have seen variations of this. Best I can find, this is the actual quote from his writing. He's talking about himself, and he says, yet though I am not what I ought to be, nor what I wish to be, nor what I hope to be, I can truly say I am not what I once was. And he's comparing himself to what he was, and that's understandable. He says, I'm not what I once was, a slave to sin and Satan. And I can heartily join with the apostle and acknowledge, by the grace of God, I am what I am. Now, what Newton is saying is that he continues, even though he is not what he once was, he continues to be in desperate need of the grace of God. And it is only by the grace of God that he is what he is. And yet he acknowledges he's not what he ought to be, nor what he wishes to be, nor what he hopes one day to be. It kind of reminds me of another great letter writer, Jack Miller, who was a pastor for a number of years in suburban Philadelphia. And Jack would always say that when you first become a Christian, you have an understanding of the cross that is able to bridge the difference between your righteousness and God's holiness. And you recognize that you're a sinner, that there is a gap, but at the beginning, that cross that bridges that gap is relatively small. He says, as you go on in your Christian life, and you may in fact become significantly better than what you once were, but as you go on in your Christian life and you learn more of God and you learn more of yourselves, you realize that you're actually a much greater Savior. So that understanding of yourself goes down. You become a much greater sinner in your own eyes. You're not actually becoming a greater sinner than what you once were, but you're understanding it more deeply. You're recognizing yourself to be a much greater sinner than what you once were. He says, but as you do that, you realize that if that's true, if I'm a much greater sinner than I thought I was, and God, as I study the Lord and I study his holiness and as I study his law, I realize that he's much holier than I originally thought him to be. And if those two things are happening as we grow in grace, then the gap between the holiness of God and our understanding of ourselves is growing. Again, the gap isn't really changing, but our understanding of God's holiness is growing greater. Our understanding of our own sin is growing deeper, and the gap is much, much bigger. And that's when we realize that the grace of God is greater than we had ever understood. Because God is even holier than we had originally imagined, and we are even more sinful than we had originally imagined. Then the depth of God's grace, the power of the cross to bridge the two, is even more amazing than we had ever imagined. That's the power of the law as it continues to work in our lives and as we think about it. Like Newton said, we grow in a greater understanding when we compare ourselves to the holiness of God, but that leads us to say with the Apostle Paul, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And we thank God for his grace. Have a great day.